Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're very pleased to have you at another session of Discovery. My name is Emily. I'm the Engagement Manager at Efficiency Canada. Efficiency Canada operates within Carleton University, and we acknowledge that the location of our campus sits on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. In doing so, we acknowledge that we have a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. So I'm pleased to welcome our guest today. Kevin will walk through what municipalities need to know about the 2025 net zero emissions building codes. You will certainly walk away with a better understanding of the tools and the information you need to lead the implementation of net zero emission building codes in your jurisdiction. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you to everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on what part of the country you're in. And thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. My name is Kevin Lockhart. I'm the Research Manager here at Efficiency Canada. And today I'll be presenting on the Net Zero Emissions Code. And really it's part of the guide for municipalities on Net Zero Emissions Code. And in doing so, I'll cover off three areas related to Canada's first National Net Zero Emissions Building Code. First, I'll provide some background on the guide and the why behind it, including why we chose to focus on municipalities. Next, I'll briefly highlight some of the key issues and content in the guide. And finally, before moving on to our discussion, I'll highlight a couple of the ways how advocates can use the guide to influence the development of the Net Zero Emissions Code, which is to undergo its evolution. So as a little bit of background, in late 2021, the federal government committed to developing a Net Zero Emissions Building Code by the end of 2024. This was a big shift in buildings policy as we've seen from the past, but it also means that we have just 2 years to prepare for what's quite a significant policy change. As the Net Zero Emissions Code is being developed at the federal level, and before its adoption by provinces and territories, there's a range of issues that need to be resolved and terminology that needs to be defined. This includes a rethink of the fuels that we use to heat our buildings, but also the materials and components used to construct them. It also includes considerations for how the Net Zero Emissions Code will integrate with other high-performance codes, such as the Net Zero Energy Ready Tiered Code. In part, this is why we developed the guide, to help municipalities and others prepare for the Net Zero Emissions Building Code, and to use its development as a lever to accelerate climate action in their communities. It's meant to provide background and context for municipalities and the information that they need to make informed transition to low carbon buildings, as well as create a discussion of how municipalities can take immediate steps to cut emissions in new construction as they await the implementation of the emissions code. In terms of the code's development, and this, you can find this image in the guide as well. The development of the Net Zero Emissions Code is still in its very early stages. The policy and technical components are now being developed and will continue to be through 2023 and 2024. As a starting point, work is underway to include an emissions objective to the code's other 5 objectives, and to which Net Zero Emissions Code requirements will be linked. And some of the fundamental questions raised in the guide and elsewhere are being posed to different committees and working groups within that code's development system. As you can see, about halfway, we're at March 2023, and the Senate Committee on Energy Efficiency is now assigning working groups and task groups. While this work is underway, it bears repeating that there's an additional 18-month period under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. This means that some measures, particularly those related to embodied carbon, for which code requirements aren't expected until 2030, may not be advanced until late 2031 or 2032. So as I mentioned, it's a significant policy change, and this is because in the past, from new construction have been addressed through a fairly narrow definition of energy efficiency. And this definition didn't account for things like the fuel used to heat our buildings or the implications of material choices. The 2020 model codes now being adopted by the provinces and territories is a result, and it has the end goal of a net zero energy ready standard. However, similar to the tiered code is the BC Energy Subcode, and we can see that through that tiered energy codes alone, even at the highest tier, cannot guarantee reductions in a building's operational or embodied emissions. Now, in part, this comes down to fuel choices, and it really highlights the fuel agnostic approach that the building code has taken in the past. It also reflects the lack of an objective within the model codes dealing with GHG emissions, and that objective is now being added to the other 5 objectives, which include safety, health, accessibility for persons with disabilities, fire and structural protection for buildings, and environmental impact. Now, tiered energy codes still will play an important role. They'll be expected to act as a complement to the emissions code. And while it may not be perfectly suited to directly serve to cut both operational and embodied emissions from buildings, energy efficiency will continue to play an important role in the Net Zero Emissions Code. Now, as we've highlighted in the guide, energy efficiency can help reduce thermal demands, which in turn helps enable right-size and low-carbon heating equipment. And through energy efficiency best practices, and in particular, limiting air leakage in the building, energy efficiency measures can also help reduce thermal energy losses and then limit the amount of high embodied emission materials needed to reach the upper tier levels of building performance in the net zero codes and other high performance building standards. A good example of this is insulation. If we pull down that air leakage, we can reduce high embodied materials like insulation in the wall assemblies. Now, going a step further, reduced energy demands can also serve to avoid potential grid constraints and manage peak loads associated with increased electrification of our buildings. It can also be used to free electricity resources that can be used for further electrification, namely existing buildings and transportation. The emissions code is a change in how our codes tackle emissions in building operations and materials by limiting those emissions directly rather than continue to use energy as a proxy. As mentioned, the focus is on municipalities. And so why would a net zero emissions code be relevant to municipalities? For a start, our homes, workplaces, and the places we gather in account for about 13% of Canada's GHG emissions. This rises to 18% when considering electricity used for cooling, lighting, and appliance usage, and even higher when we consider the upstream impacts associated with the manufacturing of building materials or fossil fuel intensive construction processes. But as a proportion of local emissions, those in the municipality, the building sector can also often reach upwards of half of a municipality's overall emissions. All of this means that the building sector is at the center of municipal climate action. New buildings constructed today will last for half a century or more. And this means that municipalities can leverage the emissions code to lock in immediate and long-term emissions reductions and accelerate further reductions in other high-emitting sectors of the economy as well, for example, transportation. As municipalities look for ways to build a net zero economy, the net zero emissions code will play an important role in providing a standardized approach to regulating low or zero carbon buildings. The net zero emissions code can also help build off and support advanced actions of provinces like British Columbia, where municipalities this year will be able to use a carbon pollution standard to regulate low requirements later in 2023 and zero carbon standards in 2025. The net zero emissions code can also help support municipal efforts already underway in Toronto, Vancouver, and elsewhere. So as the emissions code is developed, it's important to keep in mind what the limitations are to what is currently covered under a building code. And as we highlight in the guide, codes are only one tool needed for building decarbonization, alongside the need to continue advancing things like provincial and federal energy efficiency standards for appliances and equipment, clean electricity generation, largely resulting from the federal government's commitment to achieve a net zero electricity sector by 2035, but also by increasing the uptake of on-site renewables and clean heat systems such as heat pumps and other low-carbon alternatives. An emissions code also brings new considerations. And one of the ones that we highlight in the guide is the net component of what a net zero emissions building code would mean. So typically, net zero emissions refers to the balancing of the canceling out of any emissions associated with the building's operations and materials, including equipment used in its construction. The net component of net zero is achieved through offsets that provide an emissions reduction elsewhere. So this could include, for example, renewable energy sources or low carbon energy systems to offset remaining operational or embodied emissions, all of which is currently outside the building code's purview, which you can see on the right side of the image. Offsets can also be used to act as a complement to other actions. So this would include things like materials that can store carbon and advance the circular. So clearly the low carbon materials that we will be using in the future must continue to be resilient against moisture and be durable. But if by tracking and monitoring material emissions in new constructions, it can unlock new opportunities to use buildings and construction materials as an emissions sink, as well as find high value applications for material reuse. So innovation in this area could allow builders to claim end-of-life savings off materials in pursuit of zero carbon building standards. Now, finally, offsets can be purchased also, and a good example would be carbon credits or emissions offsets. However, as we've highlighted in the guide, given that new buildings can be designed to be near zero emissions from the outset, if not today, then in the near future, net zero offsets would be particularly inappropriate for new construction. So as part of the guide, we reviewed a number of different jurisdictions within Canada and beyond, and also at different levels of government. And those jurisdictions that have already implemented a mandatory or a voluntary zero emissions building codes, as well as different voluntary certifications, have each been challenged by the questions laid out in the guide. Also with things like how to define the scope of emissions and whether or not to include a prescriptive or performance path, and also the types of metrics best suited to a zero emissions building code. And now there's a number of different flavors of these zero emissions building codes, but all of these questions will be on the table as Canada's net zero emissions code is developed over the next 2 years. So in terms of embodied emissions, one of the challenges in developing net zero emissions code is the embodied emissions. And in the CVHCC's timeline for the development of the net zero emissions code, It's proposed that no action will be taken in this area until 2030. However, as building operations become more efficient, embodied carbon or embodied emissions will become an increasingly significant issue. These are the emissions generated from raw material extraction, manufacture, transportation, and the installation of materials used in new construction. These are supply chain emissions that come from things like concrete, insulation, and cladding or siding. And the emissions from these materials are released into the atmosphere long before the building is in service. This means that increasingly, as our buildings become more efficient, outweigh operational emissions, particularly in provinces like BC, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec that have relatively clean electricity grids already. Embodied carbon is expected to account for approximately half the global building sector's emissions between now and 2050. And so it's important that we act early to draw down these emissions, particularly given that there's a unique time value component of embodied carbon. What I mean by that is that since these emissions occur at the beginning of a building life cycle, the impact on near-term emissions from the building becomes more significant. By addressing embodied emissions in new construction going forward, we can help to offset emissions arising from additional floor space in the future. Between now and 50, a significant amount of construction activity is expected to take place, and that new construction activity can be carbon intensive if left to conventional practices. Part of the challenge in addressing embodied emissions are the gaps found in existing approaches to life cycle analysis or environmental product declarations. For LCAs, the question is around scope. How do we account for emissions in extraction and manufacturing of the materials? Not to mention the end-of-life stages of how a product or material is recycled or repurposed, as well as the generated in the construction process by construction equipment. In terms of EPDs, while there's a range of EPDs available for a number of products, there is an ongoing need for a broader uptake across the gamut of construction materials and assemblies. Much of this work is already underway by both the private sector, but also through government projects and initiatives like NRC's Low Carbon Assets through Life Cycle Assessment, LCA Squared, and Construction 4.0, each of which are underway and will help support how we measure and track both operational and embodied emissions in the building sector. In terms of the emissions code, in the next few years, we'll need to find a way to simplify LCAs and make them more accessible and cost-effective for smaller projects, as well as to incorporate LCAs and potentially EPDs into things like the permitting and the compliance enforcement process. So in terms of how to use the guide, so the guide was intended to be used by both municipal staff and officials, as well as by advocates. In developing the guide, which began back in September of 2022, that followed through until early in this year, we saw a number of areas either already in place or unfolding that can be used to advance this emissions code. First up is the Natural Resources Canada Code Acceleration Fund. This fund was announced this past January, and at the beginning of this week was extended until April 14th. The CAF is meant to accelerate upper tier adoption or accelerate the implementation of other high-performance building codes. It's meant to promote higher rates of compliance with adopted codes or build capacity and support market preparedness for ambitious code adoption. And as one of the high-performance building codes identified, the CAF also applies to the net zero emissions code as well. This means that funding is potentially available for things like technical and feasibility studies, training, software development, and permitting and compliance tools, all of which can help accelerate the implementation of the net zero emissions code, and all of which will be needed in coming years to support the emissions code. Up next, we have the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Code, which now has a consultation underway and is looking for feedback from stakeholders on draft policy recommendations that will go into the emissions code. Consultation wave 1 began in early February and ends this coming Monday, whereas wave 2 will run from April to June. It's important to note that public consultations will also on the proposed requirements for the emissions code will unfold over the next couple of years, and these are an opportunity to comment on the technical aspects of the code. The guide also shares ways to encourage local action, both by municipalities and others, mostly through things like developing and sharing case studies on low carbon construction practices, as well as implementation guides for choosing operational or embodied emission boundaries, and also how to use common tools to measure emissions. For municipalities, as a central player in code implementation, municipalities can help increase awareness and build the necessary knowledge infrastructure needed to reduce emissions in buildings, and they can do so largely through things like incentives, which can encourage zero carbon heating and hot water systems, but also help reduce financial barriers to heat pumps or electrification in new construction. Those are the voluntary measures, whereas some municipalities may have existing authorities to require low emissions or all electric equipment. The Charter City of Vancouver is a good example of this, where they have used their existing powers to mandate specific targets and actions to achieve zero emissions buildings in all new buildings by 2030, largely through the Zero Emissions Building Plan. But we also have other cities without the Charter City powers of Vancouver, such as Montreal, which will use its bylaw powers to mandate a zero emission standard for all new construction, That begins in 2025. And the city of Victoria, which will require all new construction to produce no emissions as of 2025. Municipalities can also tackle low embodied carbon materials, such as by using their existing powers as well. And so largely this is through the procurement process where the municipality can mandate low carbon requirements, such as is ongoing in Langford, BC, such as concrete. So using a procurement process to mandate low embodied concrete to then shift the market from conventional products to low carbon alternatives. So to wrap up, as we develop the emissions code, it's important to look back at where codes have come. And so since their introduction in the Canadian market in the 1940s, building codes have helped raise the minimum performance of Canadian buildings. This is the first areas approach were safety, health, durability, and accessibility, but also more recently, energy efficiency. By applying the same approach to reducing GHG emissions in new construction, we can take an important step towards a market transformation of the building sector. This is because building codes act as a highly effective market signal to industry, manufacturers, and consumers. They set and define long-term and durable net zero emission standards, and then help to deliver the certainty that market actors need to direct investments in low carbon technology, processes, and infrastructure. And they do this while setting a market floor for standards of new construction that ensure each new building constructed in Canada contributes to our net zero goals and long-term resilience. And finally, before we move on to our discussion, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the Low Carbon Cities Canada Network for supporting this project, as well as helping provide insights and perspective on what Canadian municipalities need to know to prepare for the net zero emissions building code. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. All right, folks, feel free to add your questions in the Q&A box. We already have a few here, but if you have any more, feel free. So, Kevin, first up, are there any significant deficits in construction expertise to build the buildings we need to reduce emissions to zero and increase efficiency? I am thinking solar shading, HVAC, insulation, and triple glazed windows, etc.
So deficits in terms of the equipment that we need, or in the code, if I could ask for a clarification.
Sounds like construction expertise.
Okay. I think that there is some steps towards looking at low embodied materials and how we approach buildings, and whether or not the practices that we've taken from energy efficiency should apply, or if we can abandon those in favor of material switching, basically. I think that we continue on that journey of improving how we develop energy efficient buildings and take those same practices to low emissions buildings. And as part of that, it's really looking at, do we have capacity, the overall capacity of the market, energy advisors, trades, and an understanding in all of those, as well as professions, of how we approach our construction. I also think there's a gap in capacity or availability of things like LCAs and EPDs, and I pointed to a couple of government initiatives to do, but I also think that there's ample room in the private sphere to develop tools that are already on the market further and really make them highly accessible, easy for small builders to apply to their projects.
Thanks, Kevin. Jim is asking if the code will cover full WBLC. I'm not too sure what the acronym is, but he specifies deconstruction/reuse.
Yeah, whole building life cycle assessment. And I think that those are one of the questions I mentioned that are on the table for the codes committees to work through. I think that's probably the best approach to, and where we will end up eventually. But again, there's a refinement or a maturity needed in those processes to be able to apply a whole building assessment. And when I say that, it's not necessarily that those tools aren't prepared today to use in projects, but at scale. And so can they be used across the country in a code which is aimed at all segments of the market, those that are at the top already doing high performance buildings, or those just starting out in their journey?
Is the intent to prohibit the use of fossil fuels, natural gas, propane in buildings for space heating and water heating? If so, when would that be implemented?
I can't speak to that, as that's not within my powers. But I think if we look at the net zero energy ready tiers, as we reach tiers, it certainly helps to limit fossil fuels in the building. And if we extend that to the emissions code, imagining that we'll reach zero operational emissions, I think we come to difficult decisions about how we treat the fuels in our buildings. And if we look at as on one of the slides was the lessons from the BC STEP code, that really an all-electric building really approaches zero emissions quite quickly, whereas fossil fuel building is quite challenging, if not impossible. So how do we reach zero emissions buildings in our buildings and do it with a number of different fuels?
Thank you. What are some of the examples of current compliance tools and what is needed to improve compliance?
In terms of compliance tools for net zero emissions, the code is still under development. And I think those are areas that need to be developed. But the work is also underway to begin doing that and to begin accounting for emissions. And we can look at different projects in areas of the country and start to learn lessons from them. Overall, I think it's important that we have some ambition in this iteration of the 2025 net zero emissions code and look at different ways that we can support compliance. And so that being the development of tools, but also, as we highlighted in our recommendations, rather than putting off measures for embodied carbon until 2030, why not approach something in a simplified measure-only approach so that we can start building awareness and start identifying what those challenges are in the compliance and enforcement processes.
This might be a tough one to think of on the spot, but which municipalities would you look at for examples of incentives in play? And are there any examples of municipalities forbidding gas hookups for new subdivisions?
So for the last question, I think there's been attempts in BC, but they're still working their way through the process and if that's a legitimate approach or a feasible approach. And there is a list in the guide, a table outlining what those are, or different municipalities and as well. But I would point to, obviously we have the large municipalities like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal that are moving quite quickly, but there's also really strong measures and unique measures in Victoria and Langford, which I mentioned. And they're really starting to move quickly in terms of how they're approaching operational emissions first and emissions next. The incentives largely fall within what those municipalities already have. And so it could be things like floor space accommodations, or tax benefits, or speeded permits. And that's where I think it's really important to take the apparatus and the mechanism, the framework that we've used to incorporate energy efficiency into our codes and replicate those with emissions as well. They might not be perfect in total or well practiced.
Thanks, Kevin. We've got a lot of questions here. Will passive house standards be encouraged along with other standards, such as different levels of?
That would largely, I believe, be up to the municipalities. But again, I would just go back to my previous comment about the mechanisms that we've used in the past for energy efficiency. We don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. We can use existing programs either through municipalities or utilities or in larger federal or provincial programs to then tackle how we move or how we reduce and incentivize reductions in buildings.
David is asking if the Reno code is coming soon.
The alterations to existing building code is also expected for 2025 and underway. How it interplays with the emissions code will be interesting. And I would say that the emissions code is expected to play a complement to the tiered energy code. I would expect the same with the alterations to existing buildings, but with the caveat of at some point, as that alteration to existing building code is developed, it builds off the NECB and the National Energy Code for Building and the National Building Code, and which currently don't have those provisions in them. And do we see that in 2025 in the AEB, or is that something that we see down the road in 2030? It's a good question.
How would the emissions code work with the net zero energy ready code?
Again, I think that's something to be decided. So still, when I say early, incredibly early within the development of the emissions code. And so we saw late in 2022, we saw the outline of requirements and the outline of what the emissions code would look like being developed by the federal government within organizations like Natural Resources Canada and National Research Centre. And those have moved to the Standing Committee on Energy Efficiency as well, and to its working groups and task groups. And that's really where those decisions will be worked out. I just then make the link that the public consultation period closes Monday for the net zero emissions code. As mentioned, that was wave one, and I think we've shared our recommendations. But there will also be public comment periods at which I'm using resources like the net zero emissions guide can add their feedback and their comments on how they see the net zero emissions code interacting with different codes, both the net zero energy ready and the alterations to existing buildings.
Thanks, Kevin. The link to the comments, Efficiency Canada's comments to the public review were shared in the chat if anyone would like to access them. This might be a more technical question, Kevin. So Andrew is stating that the weather files that are used for NBC 2020 and NECB 2020 are obsolete weather files. Is Efficiency Canada looking at weather in the whole context of the net zero code recommendations?
That wasn't included in those recommendations in particular. Those recommendations respond directly to posed by the Canadian Board for Harmonized course, the CVHC. And so it answers those questions directly. Whereas the climate files, I think it's fair to say that's a recognized challenge or issue, and it is being worked through code development within the code development system. Those files are being updated and in an effort to more closely reflect our changing climate and the conditions that we build our buildings in going down the future to 2050.
Great. Warren has posed kind of a comment, but I'm thinking we may be able to switch it to a question about products and suppliers. Has there been any movement to disclosing the carbon or CO2 embedded into these products? So, for example, concrete.
And it's actually a good example of the work being done to identify the emissions within the product and to provide a robust EPD. And being one of the highest emitting materials in the most buildings, that's a good first step. And alongside things like the procurement in Langford, and that procurement process is also going through the federal greening government initiative as well, and also mandating lower carbon content concrete. All those things help shift the market. But we do need EPDs and robust EPDs that really walk back through the entire process, manufacturing process. And then we also have to decide what the limits of those are. Is it source? Is it either the reuse, recycling, or disposal of those materials? And so I guess to answer the question, there are a number of different initiatives underway, both in the private and public sector. And we really need to, I guess, galvanize support around the development of those so that we can see faster action on embodied emissions.
Thanks, Kevin. Do you think LCA models will be standardized, as many different softwares are spitting out different results depending on the inputs?
I don't know that I can speak to the standardization, but when I look at codes, and I had an interesting question responding to our recommendations that did highlight the work being done at NRC with the LCA Squared Initiative and the Construction Innovation 4.0. Or Construction 4.0. I think that those tools are being developed and ideally positioned to back codes. Codes, again, need to be deployed at scale across the entire country. And where something might work on an individual project, we have to consider a broader range of projects that it will be used for. Standardization of anything I'm a fan of. But in terms of this, I think that the goal would be to have those assets developed by NRC and then alternatives. And we've seen the same in energy efficiency where we're seeing government tools or processes deployed first, and then the sector builds off of those and can go even deeper. And yeah, there's a number of good examples in that vein.
Thank you. Ty is asking, I think, a related question. Are environmental product disclosures, EPDs, done on a standardized basis? And do they need to be?
I think there's a couple of different variations of doing so. There's a similar to each, but that aspect is still being developed. Or sorry, the standardized approach isn't there. And it's whether or not we need one is, again, similar to the question before. I think it would be a benefit, but whether or not it's a requirement for moving forward is hard to speak of. What I think we need in EPDs and LCAs is both, and as mentioned in the presentation, particularly in the next few years, to find a simplified way to have either material or whole building life cycle analysis done so that it can really reach the smaller builders. It can really reach the builders or developers that really want to tackle emissions in the now versus down the road. When we look at embodied emissions, right now the requirement is 2030, or sorry, the requirements are expected to come in 2030. There's also an additional adoption period. And so that means we're really looking at it 2032. So 9 years of waiting for action. And so I think the building sector can really, by acting quickly, developing those tools, developing the confidence in both LCAs and EPDs, can help accelerate that action. And whether it's through codes or through different standards at federal, provincial level, or at the municipal level, I think anything that the sector can do to advance the maturity and the confidence that we can have in LCAs and EPDs will advance action on embodied emissions.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Are there any thoughts of looking at whole life carbon rather than net zero energy or low embodied carbon in isolation, since there are often trade-offs that would move away from the optimal points of each in order to get to the lowest whole life carbon design?
I think my best answer to that would be posing that question in the ongoing consultation that closes Monday. So that's a lot of work for the weekend, but I think those are the types of questions that the codes development, as well as the sectors, are struggling with, is how do we reach that optimal balance, and where do different requirements fit into the system? As I mentioned, codes are only one part of an ecosystem of building decarbonization, and there are inherent limits to to their role in that system. And I think that some of those questions will be answered in the coming years.
Great. Are only considered with respect to kilowatt hour or also kilowatt demand?
Good question that I'm not sure I can answer, but we'll look into.
No worries. And I think a final question for you, Kevin. Good work fielding all of these. How does Efficiency Canada's work fit with other organizations such as the CAGBC?
I think we're part of an ecosystem that helps advance the net zero economy. And so really the role we play is first in sound research. And so looking at some of the questions that were asked today and beyond, and trying to figure out what the correct policy approach is, reviewing the current policy landscape, figure out where we need to be and what the approach to get there, communicating it through forums like this and through our website, and then building a community around that as well. And then using that community, engaging that community to then for change in the policy system. And I think that ties in nicely with other organizations who may offer education and training or skills development or support in the form of things like incentives, and then working with organizations like LC3 to help then bring that to the relevant decision makers and then I guess disseminate those lessons throughout.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I think we'll stop it there for questions. We've just got about a minute left. I think everyone on the call can appreciate the breadth of your knowledge and are thankful for all the questions you answered today. Stay connected by joining us on our newsletter, our Discovery Hub, to learn about developments across the country in energy efficiency. So thanks again for joining us today. Thanks, Kevin, for fielding all these questions. Great session. Have a good Friday, everyone.
Great day.